Welcome to the Third Rail Pod. I am your host, Mason. We still do not have a tagline. Probably will never have a tagline. So let's just go ahead and dive right into it. Star Wars Rise of Skywalker has been out about 48 hours now to the general public. A couple people, of course, saw it ahead of time, early screeners, etc. But us normals, us peasants, have had about 48 hours of access to chew into this thing. And I've already posted a spoiler-free review on my blog, masonsthoughts.com. Link to the review will be in the description. You probably have seen the title of the Third Rail podcast episode or my blog, so you know that I thought this movie was, to put it politely, bad. So, ground rules. This is not just there will be spoilers. This is, I'm assuming that you have seen the movie. So if you're listening, you think you've either seen the movie or you do not care about spoilers at all. Now, I don't think you should particularly care about spoilers in this movie because it sucks. Just straight up bad, and we'll kind of dive into that in a moment. Or you just don't care about spoilers. So let's go ahead and dive in. Movie sucked. So I want to start with just sort of the, let's call it level one of the suckage, the sort of the craft of the film. So the first thing, and you kind of notice it right up front, is the sequences, particularly for the first 2/3 of the movie, are shockingly rushed, sloppy, boring. Like, Kylo Ren explores the depths of space, finds the hidden Sith planet whose name escapes me right now, goes to the hidden Sith planet, finds out Palpatine is alive, learn that Palpatine has some secret about Rey's parentage. We'll get into all that when we get a little bit deeper into the dive here, when we get to the, let's call it level 2, level 3 of suckage. And so, hints at that, like, basically everything in The Last Jedi is bullshit. So, like, right up front, the movie is basically saying, like, fuck the last movie, which was a masterpiece, but, again, that's not a matter of craft. So all of that happens within about a minute 30. And then the next sequence is you find out there's a spy working for the Resistance, which I'm trying to remember honestly if they actually bother with that. I think I'm pretty sure this one actually, whereas like The Last Jedi kind of gave up on just calling them the Resistance, and we're like, no, it's the Rebellion. This one goes through the motions of calling the Resistance. So when I say Resistance, Rebellion, I'm not drawing a distinction between the two. Resistance is Rebellion, vice versa. So the Resistance, we find out, has a spy in the First Order. They beam the, I guess, hidden spy stuff to the Millennium Falcon. And then Poe and Finn escape within about a minute. Like, honestly, it's basically, we see them, they meet alien friend. There's a really quick, like, oh, here's the information. Basically like a lame version of the sequence from like Rogue One where they're trying to pass the data tape along. And then the space TIE fighters, it's like, oh, the TIE fighters here, oh shit. They shoot one, and then they're like, oh no, they're gaining on us. They shoot a beam down to block the others, and they get away. If that sounds incredibly unthrilling, it's because it is. And the thing that's shocking about it is, like, the action scenes, there's no time to even register, the threat or the tension within these individual action sequences. It's like, oh, here's the problem, here's the solution. Just like there's no space to register threat, and this problem gets worse and worse as the movie goes on, really until the final act, which at that point the movie gets not good, but better. And then we get to Rey, and then she actually has an extended. This is basically one of the two scenes in the movie that I can remember, and I say that I can remember because much like, for example, Joker, the last movie that I did a solo pod on, much like Joker, the editing is so. It doesn't have the sequential problem that Joker does, but it's like it's so rapid and there's so much minutia and inefficiency to the story of the plot that it becomes difficult to remember. And even though I saw this movie about 48 hours ago, it's already kind of just leaking out of my ear hole. So basically, there's a pretty extended. And by extended, I mean like 2.5 minutes. It's not like extended by like normal movie logic, but like within the context of the movie, it feels super long because all the other scenes, basically until the final battle, are like blink and you miss them. And we'll get into my conspiracy theory on why that is, but we'll save that for the final level of suckage, so to speak. That's fine. And then this is where I realized like this movie is not just bad on the sort of levels that I felt concerned about, basically from the moment that they dropped on us that like, oh, Palpatine's back because we couldn't think of anything better. But it's bad on just the basic levels of like film craftsmanship. So we've got the secret plans that they got from the Millennium Falcon, and they come in and they're like, the spy has told us a great discovery. Emperor Palpatine is back. Gasp. And then C-3PO comes in and he's like, he's on the hidden Sith planet of blank. It's not known on any star charts, so we'll have to find it with blank. I'm cutting most of the space terminology out just because, again, it's like, I don't really want to be just trying to read a Wikipedia article the whole time while I'm trying to provide content to the internet. So when I say blank, I'm just referring to space content. But I mean, it honestly, I said this in the blog too, but it honestly reminded me of the Batman or Batman and Robin opening where Batman's chilling in his Batmobile. He's got like a little mini screen. It's like a little mini computer. And Commissioner Gordon comes up. It's like, Batman, there's a new villain in town. He calls himself Mr. Freeze. It's like that, but with... Whereas Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker takes itself... It's not like a serious film in the way that like Batman v Superman is, but it is... It's a film with like... It wants to have the sort of epic, operatic feel of like a Lord of the Rings or like even a historical epic to some degree. Like it's not... Whereas Batman and Robin was like, no, this is basically a cartoon in live action. We're here to sell toys. Everything has sort of an almost plasticky aesthetic. Batman has a Batman credit card. We're 100% in on the camp. And so as dumb and as bad of a opening that is to introduce Mr. Freeze as your villain, like it does fit the tone of Batman and Robin versus this fucking bullshit that happens after the train ratings montage. It's in a movie where that it's just how sloppy the plot is constructed. And it sets the tone for the rest of the movie from there. From that point onward, so then there's another real small sequence where I guess there's some indecision whether way he's going to go or not. Real force conflict where Leia's like, I don't want you to go. I want to stay here and train. And she's like, well, I'm going to go anyway. And then boom, conflict is resolved, never brought up again. So like, why did we have this in the first place? Which also brings us to, Leia actually kind of has, I wouldn't say a big part in the movie, but an important part. And it's kind of weird because maybe it's just because I'm bad at spotting CGI, but it couldn't, if if it was a CGI stand-in, I couldn't really tell the way I could with like CGI Tarkin in Rogue One, where it was just kind of immediately obvious, or even say Justice League, where they CGI removed the mustache. You can pretty much identify all the ones where the CGI removed versus not. Um, so if that was a lot of CGI as opposed to just archival footage, because I know some of the footage they'd use was like archival footage from when they were shooting the other movies, and they kind of like sort of Frankensteined it together and wrote the plot around that, which unfortunately is one of the problems of the movie. And skipping ahead a bit, they just have her die suddenly, like 2/3 of the movie. Well, if you're gonna do that, then why not just have her dead at the beginning of the movie anyway? We don't really need to see Rey training. You don't have to have a fucking obstacle course for her, but again, this movie, we're kind of skipping ahead, but ultimately one of the biggest problems with this movie is like they basically took the online criticism of Star Wars The Last Jedi and tried to respond to like every single one that would possibly be there, basically short of like the fucking dipshits on 4chan who are like labeling BB-8 as like the little white cuckball or whatever. But they're like, all right, race parentage. Nope, we're just fucking changing that right up front. Race parentage is important, and then of course we find out she's Palpatine. But again, we're moving ahead. What was another complaint? Fucking idiots online are like, oh, Rey's a Mary Sue, even though they don't really understand what a Mary Sue is, other than just it means bad character. And two, if she is a Mary Sue, then her having a training sequence after she has already, achieved being the most powerful being in the universe will not fix that non-existent issue. So, but they're so desperate to appease these fucking, Neanderthals that have become obsessed with, essentially think that Star Wars fandom is like memorizing all these expanded universe trivia, but there's not enough lore that you can pack into a movie where that would even matter. So moving on to the back on track, so then they fly to this desert island, which I think no, what happens. See, this movie is incredibly difficult to keep track of. There's another sequence, and again, this is like a solid minute, where they once again have to respond to another completely bullshit critique of Star Wars The Last Jedi, where they're like, oh no, Luke wasn't on the island moping. He was trying to find the hidden Sith planet of blank. See all the Jedi texts? The ones that he tried to burn in the previous film, need I remind you? He literally like tried to destroy the texts before Yoda stopped him. So if Luke thought they were so important, then why the fuck whatever. So I guess Luke was actually, it wasn't quite the one that kind of I've always made fun of, where like, what did you want Luke to do? Be discovering how to pull fucking Star Destroyers out of the sky? Well, I'm sure they fucking would have done that if Luke was still alive in this film. I'm surprised they didn't just have him be like, just kidding, I'm alive. That would have really fit with the rest of the movie, I suppose. But I guess they couldn't quite take it that far. So they're like, actually, the last movie never happened. He was actually on the island just trying to figure out where Palpatine is, I suppose. Because he knew that Palpatine was on the hidden Sith planet, but he also didn't fucking bother to tell anyone else. And I know it sounds sort of like I'm picking nits, which one of the things that I've kind of raged against is sort of the nitpicking Last Jedi, where people are like, oh, well, actually, the throne room scene sucks because they CGI one of the weapons out of the Red Guard's hand toward the end of the fight because they realized that the choreography was flawed. Well, yes, that is a flaw, but the fundamental story underpinnings of The Last Jedi are subversive, brilliant, etc., etc. This is not a Last Jedi podcast yet. Um, Whereas my point is so little care in the construction of the story was taken, where like basically as far as this movie is concerned, it it desperately wanted to pretend like the Last Jedi essentially never happened, outside of the Rey Kylo Ren dynamic. It kept it to a degree. It kept that dynamic, and it more or less wanted to just pretend like, as a really small, tiny example. All right, so Leia present one of the weird through lines of this movie is like that kind of just gets dropped until it's like shown in the beginning, through lines completed, they drop it, okay, whatever, and then they add it to the end of the movie is like Luke's original lightsaber. Now, people who saw The Last Jedi even once may remember that lightsaber got torn in half at the end of the second act of the last Jedi. When the ship gets torn in half, they like smash the lightsaber in itty bitty pieces, and then Rey has to escape. So essentially, you have to either one, literally just pretend The Last Jedi never happened, or two, come up with like sort of a convoluted headcanon scenario. It's like, oh yeah, she woke up first after the explosion. She took all the time to get all the necessary pieces so they could reconstruct Luke's lightsaber, which ultimately is a complete waste of time, of course, because then the movie kind of reveals that, before they go off to the final battle, that actually Leia has her own lightsaber and has been trained as a Jedi, which it's kind of strange then why Luke Skywalker is then necessarily, it's just retroactively, like, again, the only thing this movie cares about is appeasing people who had disingenuous criticisms of The Last Jedi. And so they're like, oh, one of the things people complain about is like Leia Mary Poppins, doing the Mary Poppins and getting back into the ship. So their solution to that is essentially to retcon the previous two films and be like, actually, Leia is essentially a fully trained Jedi, yet has, for some reason, during this entire period of time, never using her Jedi skills other than saving her own life when she gets spaced. Now, as far as that scene is concerned, and unfortunately, I don't want to make this whole podcast sort of like, here's why Last Jedi is good, or here's why Last Jedi is actually good. But when the movie you're discussing is essentially constructed to respond to criticisms of the previous movie, and you as the podcaster, and by you I mean of course myself, vehemently disagree with those criticisms, then it becomes essentially impossible not to make it a co-podcast where some of the podcast is going to be inherently me just recapping for the 30th time why The Last Jedi is great. So The Last Jedi, understands how the fucking Force works, where the Force is supposed to be this thing, as it's treated in the original trilogy, is supposed to be this sort of, it's not to say that you don't train to become a Force user, but it's something that you can inherently feel. It's sort of a, like, in other fantasy works, a lot of times will have what they call wild magic, something that just kind of is instinctual and that you feel and that you don't have to necessarily be, there's not necessarily super intellectual application to it. Like, Luke gets onto the Millennium Falcon and is able to deflect blaster bolts with his eyes shut within essentially a couple of hours instruction at most as far as like the film language cares to communicate to us. So you're like, well, then that make him a Mary Sue. Well, again, you can't say that he breaking the for Luke Skywalker to be a Mary Sue, like he would have to be breaking the rules of the Star Wars universe, and it's early enough in the film where you can't really define that because and throughout the film it's sort of treated as like yeah you kind of just learn to feel and you'll that's why the Jedi philosophy is basically chill out, let go, sort of feel the life force energy around you. It's very Eastern religious philosophy essentially. And the Last Jedi sort of returns to that understanding of the Force. The Force Awakens prior doesn't really take a stand one way or never. It's not really weirdly not super interested in the nature of the Force itself. And the prequels kind of take the more like literal like power levels, more of like a hard fantasy system or hard magic system as opposed to like what you'd call a soft magic system, one that kind of has fewer rules and kind of bends around those rules. So, and then the brilliant thing the Last Jedi does is that it actually is like, yeah, the prequel Jedi kind of fucking sucked, which is why Palpatine was able to, you know, essentially wipe them all out because they had become so obsessed with, you know, essentially religious fanaticism. Like ultimately the prequel Jedi were the Westboro Baptist Church mixed with like the FBI in space. So it's like, yeah, these guys are kind of shitty. And that's why Luke in the movie is like, fuck being a Jedi forever. I'm going to cut myself off from the Force and just kind of sit here and mope around and drink wacky green breast milk and fish with a like 20-foot long sphere. But little did we know now, as far as the canon's concerned, he was actually trying to defeat Palpatine the whole time by hunting down his location. He wasn't hiding at all because the previous movie essentially didn't happen. So it's essentially, let's just go ahead and move on with the rest of the film for now. So they go on to this desert planet because 3PO, I think either 3PO or the spy is like, hey, this is where you need to go. And essentially they're looking for the next piece of the puzzle. So Luke on the island, he's got the first piece of the puzzle of finding the hidden Sith planet. The next piece of the puzzle then is they have to get like a Jedi hunting dagger. It's not clearly explained, but whatever. And that gets us to again the lack of filmmaking quality. So back to the first level of suckage, where they get there and like everyone's the aliens on this desert planet are kind of like having a festival, and then C-3PO is like, oh, this is the alien race blank. This is their life festival, which they have once every 47 years. You should be honored to be here. And the last bit, he's like actually kind of a little sarcastic, which is kind of funny. But it's really funny how like they had to drag C-3PO along for basically the first 2/3 of the movie, which is essentially just a really long fetch quest. Because they needed C-3PO to essentially stand there and deliver expository dialogue to explain everything as bluntly and efficiently as possible because there's so much plot they have to get through. And you're, you know, again, I'm assuming essentially you've seen the movie. So you'll understand, like, yeah, there's like 3 more MacGuffins to go, and he has to explain each one in the most blunt fucking way possible. It's like, oh, this dagger has the encryptions, which will lead us to the I think the pyramid things are supposed to be holocrons, but it's never explicitly called a holocron, I think. I can't imagine someone who is unfamiliar with the expanded universe having any idea what the fuck's going on other than just like, well, no, the dagger leads to the pyramid, which leads to the planet. And some of you guys who may have taken a screenwriting class or maybe simply enjoy movies that are, efficiently told, are like, why does there have to be three different steps to find the planet? They're all essentially just MacGuffins without any sort of emotional baggage to any of the main characters. Well, congratulations, you are able to write a better script than fucking cool the four different credited story writers. Colin Trevorrow still got a story credit. Ryan Johnson did not, even though he was originally slated to write the script for the last movie. J. Abrams did, and then two people I wasn't familiar with. I think one of them was J. Abrams's kind of main collaborator he's had throughout his career as far as script writing, and then I believe the last one was Trevorrow's guy. But so we've got three different fucking MacGuffins that got to hunt down. We're on MacGuffin 1, and they're like, oh shit. They bring back the force time thing from the last movie where, they're Kylo Ren and Rey are essentially just doing like FaceTime with the force. And he's like, oh, I know where you are now. And then like no later than maybe one cut. So Kylo Ren basically, they do the connection thing, and he's like, aha, I know where you are. Despite the fact that, in the last movie, it's established that he can't figure out where she is. But just assume from here on out that essentially anything that happened in The Last Jedi did not happen, because the movie kind of goes out of its way to explicitly contradict everything that happened in that movie. Not just in these big, the obvious things, Rey being Palpatine's daughter, but small fucking things, petty things like how the force time thing works. It's just like, no, this actually works the exact opposite of what the last movie, how it worked, just because I guess J. Abrams just doesn't like Ryan Johnson. So he finds him, and then it's like the next cut is like, the Empire's here, because this movie is edited like it's on fucking cocaine. Like, it's so fast. I've spent 30 minutes talking about 20-ish minutes a movie, I think. Like, it's just like boom, 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 boom. Everything. And then we'll get to the shitty action sequence in a moment. So then they're running around, the First Order's trying to find them. And then they run into a tent, and it's like, oh, Lando Calrissian, you happen to be here. All right, whatever. And then they're out of the tent. Less than 30 seconds later, there's like, oh, hi, Lando. And then Lando's like, Lando has no story purpose. When I say like he has no reason to be there, I don't mean like in the sense that like, oh, this is a bad plot contrivance, which it also kind of is, but whatever. The real problem is like he adds nothing to the story other than, well, he's going to show up later, so let's have him here. So basically he helps them hide for about 2 seconds, and then he's like, and then there's like some TIE fighters overhead, and he's like, oh, gotta get out of here. It's like, well, thanks for being super helpful, dude. So, and he gives some vaguely motivational thing. Then you run into the stormtroopers with jetpacks that you see in the trailer. And again, this has the same what I was talking about with the the opening where they're getting the information from the rebel spy, where essentially every single action sequence in this movie up until the final battle, and even that one has that problem too. It's like, here's a problem, here's a solution. There's literally no in-between space to build tension in any of the fucking action sequences in this movie. It's just like, oh no, they've cut us off from the path we're trying to go. Blam! All right, killed that one. On to the next then it'll be like, oh no, they've shot down our fighter, and then it's literally after the fighter gets shot down, they just shoot the guy out of the sky, and there's no tension built, and then it's like, oh no, we're in quicksand. And then the quicksand is like, at this point I honestly thought the movie had been going. I was like, so this is like the end of the second act, right? I check my phone. It's like the movie time showing is 10 o'clock. I go there. It's 10:40, and I know there's usually about at least 10 minutes of trailers. So it's like I'm only 30 minutes into this fucking thing. So they're in the quicksand. They drop in, and once again, problem comes up. It's like, oh no, Finn and or Chewie might be dead. Nope, never mind. They're fine. Again, it's just like problem solution. It's like there's literally, I get it. There's not necessarily, it's not necessarily a huge point of tension in the movie that like someone just died in the random thing of quicksand, but like you can give 20 seconds of like looking around and like showing emotional distress, and it tension is good in movies. I shouldn't have to explain this to J.J. Abrams, someone who has made a wide range of big budget action adventure movies ranging from average to pretty good. Like, Star Trek 2008 is like a really solid film with a story that is efficient in using the visual language of film to communicate things, so you don't have to have a golden robot standing there being like, this is the next plot point. And the action sequences have tension in that fucking movie. Mission Impossible 3. Even Star Trek Into Darkness, which I thought was kind of a piece of shit, but, has competently directed action sequences and has beginning, middle, end. Super 8, again, like he knows how to construct an action sequence. So it's just baffling that these are so bad, which it honestly, this movie, the best way to describe its plot, particularly within the first, like I said, up until the final battle, is it honestly, it doesn't even feel like a movie that I've ever seen before. It honestly feels like a video game plot where the video game was rushed in production because EA or Ubisoft, or pick your least favorite publishing company in charge, was like, you need to release this in 12 months. Sorry, you don't get the normal 18th month development cycle. So then after they had like the basic mechanics of the video game worked out, they're just like, okay, write in a plot, reuse the assets, let's plug it into the assembly line. It honestly is like that bad, sloppy. Again, the expository dialogue, they literally do not give a fuck about making it feel like character dialogue at all. It feels, C3PO just feels like the NPC. C3PO in this movie, basically until he gets his brain wiped, which we'll get into that, until he gets his brain wiped by the tiny little alien, is essentially a video game NPC in this fucking thing. It's like you realize like C3PO is a good character. He's a good iconic character. He's funny, situationally funny. He's not a fucking video game NPC. So, the quicksand stuff happens. They're like, oh, we found the guy. He's dead. I guess this is where they find the dagger. And then, C3, they get out. I'm trying to remember how they get out. I think they run into the worm. So there's this worm that I killed him. Rey's like, here, let me heal you. So again, that kind of runs back to the original point where like dipshit fanboys are like, well, Rey's a Mary Sue because she has abilities no one else has ever had. So the training montage doesn't fix that complaint if you're trying to fix it. And then this moment where she's just like, oh yeah, let me heal the worm that has like a gash in its gut. That goes back to the more traditional original trilogy view of the Force, where it's sort of instinctual, wild, something you kind of feel out more than like learning all these techniques and powers. So she heals the worm, and then I guess the worm helps him. It's not really explained how they get out. They're out. And then we get to sort of the tour de force, the oeuvre grand of the fucking shittiness of this movie. So they get out and they're like, oh, hey, there's a spaceship. And Rey's like, this spaceship feels familiar. We'll get to that in a moment. So they're getting ready. They're going to get on the spaceship. And then Rey's just kind of like staring into blank space. And then she just starts walking away for no reason. She's like, I have to face him. I guess she thinks like, my time is up. My time is now, John Cena. It just defies all logic of how a person would behave in that situation. It's like, now's the time we have to, while I'm endangering all my friends, go ahead and face him down. She cuts down, and then this is the oeuvre de grave that I was talking about. So Chewbacca walks out of the ship because Poe and Finn are like, hey, what's dipshit Rey doing over here? Chewbacca, go get her so he can leave. Chewbacca, you see one clip, you see one shot of Chewbacca starting to walk out of the spaceship. And then literally the very next fucking thing you see is like Chewbacca is shackled and has like the neck shackle around him. And they've captured him just off camera. They literally just cut out him getting captured and just didn't even bother to show like one shot of him getting like stun gunned from behind or something. It was literally like they show the establishing shot of him walking out and then he's captured. There's not even like an in between of like Rey doing something. Then it's shocking. And then Kylo Ren shows up alone. They're flying away with Chewbacca. They do the I'm going to push the ship away, and she's going to try to pull the ship back in, and then she accidentally force lightnings the ship into a million fucking pieces and kills Chewbacca. This happens. Like, does anyone remember in the expanded universe how they killed Chewbacca there? They, like, dropped a moon on him, and fans were famously pissed off because they essentially killed Chewbacca off screen. At the very least, in the expanded universe version, he was like, making a sacrifice play so that everyone else could escape from the Yuzang Vong and not die. And this one is just like Chewbacca walked out, get captured, and then gets blown to bits. Only everyone's like, wasn't Chewbacca alive in the movie? Yeah, he doesn't actually die. So, but imagine me in the movie at that moment. I was like, damn, they did him fucking dirty. They blew him up off screen. Well, then you find out Chewbacca's alive. It's like the next. So Rey and the gang get away. And again, they literally don't show them getting away. Kylo Ren and Rey just kind of like stare blankly at each other after she, as far as we know in the audience at the time, blowed Chewbacca in the tiny little Wookiee meat bits. And then it just cuts to them and they've escaped. They didn't even bother to film a fucking escape sequence. And then it cuts and it's like, oh, no, don't worry. Chewbacca's alive. He's on Kylo Ren's ship. He's been captured as a prisoner. Somehow, I guess I had to sit down and really think about this one because I was like, there's no way he survived that. Like, it's not like she brought the ship down and it crashed like in, The Force Awakens where Finn and Poe gets sucked into the sinkhole with the bits of the ship, but the ship itself was mostly intact in The Force Awakens. This was like blown into tiny little pieces. So I guess just coincidentally, Chewbacca happened to be on the other important prison transport, and Rey and Kylo Ren were fighting over, I guess, the one they both either thought Chewbacca was on or I don't know. I suppose maybe Kylo Ren was just like, no, I won't let her take down a single ship because I really care about the lives of my people. I guess. Who fucking knows? So I guess Chewbacca was on the other ship, and all the fighting about the previous ship was for no reason. And apparently, neither of the Force-sensitive people could figure out that, oh, Chewbacca isn't on this ship, despite the fact that about 3 scenes later, Rey's like, oh, I can sense Chewbacca on the ship. He's alive after all, guys. Even though the ship Chewbacca's on in that scene is like way farther away than it would have, the ship that Rey was trying to pull inward and Kylo Ren was trying to pull outward, and then they blew up. And at no point was she like, oh, don't worry, Chewbacca wasn't on that ship, you dumb fucks. Like I said, bad movie just from like just a craftsmanship level. So then they get to the planet with Penis Head, who is like Poe's ex-girlfriend, Spice Runner. They get there. I forgot to mention that there's a whole thing with, again, this is like MacGuffin number 2 is like, well, so you have to figure out a way to translate the dagger so that they can get to the mini pyramid so that they can get to the Sith planet. So there's 3 steps here. Step 1, get the dagger. Good deal. We've got the dagger. Step 2, well, they lose the dagger. So this is another one of the things where it's like, oh, this is an obstacle. No, never mind. We solved it immediately. So everyone's like, oh no, we lost the dagger. Then like the next fucking line of dialogue is like C-3PO is like, yeah, unfortunately there's no way we can do the dagger. If only, he's like, it's only in my memory banks now. And then that sets up the next video game fetch quest where they have to escort C-3PO to get his brain erased so that he's allowed, because his programming like forbids translation of Sith language, but then is still capable of translating Sith language. Whatever, fine. It's a contrivance. So they do all that. They have a pretty stereotypical rooftop scene where Poe and his ex-girlfriend, Penis Head, are just sitting there kind of chatting about like, hey, what have you been up to? Man. And then like Penis Head is like, no, you have to believe in yourself. The rebellion will do great. It's like, what do you care for? You're a spice runner. Like, isn't Poe supposed to be convincing you of why the rebellion's going to succeed and you should join them, rather than you being like, no, you're going to win? And the scene is also weirdly long, and not long in like the sense of like, it's bad cinema, but like long and compared to the rest of the movie. So like this scene is like a solid 1.5 to 2 minutes, which again would be the normal length of time for that type of scene in this type of movie. But when every other scene is also that length or shorter, then it's like, what the fuck? Why is this scene so long? Again, we'll get into my conspiracy theory. I'm going to leave that to the end of the fucking podcast. The First Order shows up again, basically fucking immediately. This movie is absolutely bonkers. Like at this point, we've been on like 6 different planets. Let's count them down real quick. So we get introduced to the Sith planet in the opening scene of the movie, the one where they're like, or J.J. Abrams looks at, gets under Palpatine's robe, looks into the camera. You see the glint in his glasses. He's like, guys, don't worry. We're just going to pretend The Last Jedi didn't happen, even though it was a critically acclaimed masterpiece, got Oscar buzz, and the only people who didn't like it were, alt-right dipshits, trivia-obsessed fanboys, and Russian trollbots. We're just going to pretend that movie never happened. So that's location number 1. Location number 2 is whatever fucking planet they're on to steal the rebel stuff. planet number 3 is basically the new Resistance base where they're doing all the expository dialogue and Rey's doing her training on. You've got the desert planet, and you've got this planet. So I guess it would only be 5 planets, but there are also a couple scenes on Kylo Ren's ship, which isn't a planet, but it's a 6th location. So if you want to give me credit for getting the number right, go ahead. But let's say 5.5 planets, since Star Destroyer is like what 1/10 of a planet. We can round it up to half. So we've already been like 6 pretty different, distinct locations. We're like maybe an hour into this, like in this movie. In comparison, I'm just curious. So let's just roll it back to like A New Hope, for example. A New Hope has like what 3 locations? Because you've essentially got Tatooine, Death Star, Tantive 4, and then that's it. That's all the locations in the movie. In Revenge of the Sith, even, which has more of a budget, you've got Utapau for the Grievous stuff, Coruscant. I don't really count any of the places you see in like Order 66 because those are there for about 10 seconds. It's just like a montage. You've got let's go ahead, and if I'm going to count Kylo Ren ship as half, we can go half for like basically the cold open of Revenge of the Sith where they rescue Palpatine. So we're up to 2.5. How many other locations? Mustafar 3.5, and that is it. I'm pretty sure, as far as named planet-sized locations in the movie, 3.5 for the entire movie Revenge of the Sith. We're already up to 5.5 for this fucking thing, and the Sith planet I am counting as a whole one, even though I didn't count the Order 66 spots because the last third of the movie takes place there. So we're up to 5.5 fucking locations already on this goddamn thing. And so then the First Order shows up again, yet another like really fucking awful chase action sequence where it's like, oh, here's the problem, it's solved. Here's the problem, it's solved. And then it's just like, oh, hey, Chewbacca's alive. We need to go up there and rescue him. But for some reason, they didn't do that. So she could send him now. But again, whatever. Plot contrivance. We'll move on. So they sneak up to the ship using, actually, this is MacGuffin number. This is a little mini MacGuffin, but Penis Head gives Poe a, like, starship chip that basically lets you into, bypass all Imperial measures just because they needed that as a plot device so that they could get onto the ship to rescue Chewbacca. Woo! So they do that. They get on the ship. They have one that actually is okay, although, again, it does kind of fly in the face of sort of how the Force time worked in the previous film. So everyone else gets captured. Neato. One of the few sequences that works in this movie is like they actually get captured. And then there's another sequence that happens in between, right? So you've actually given the fucking audience time to be like, oh, how will they get out of this? Because, we as an audience assume most of the time the good guys are going to win in most movies, but we're still curious, like, how are they going to win? So then you get to Rey. She's like, oh, I have a feeling that this is where we'll find the next thing we need to do what we're going to do. And again, essentially using the Force is like a Deus Ex Machina, but whatever. So she goes in, it's like, oh, I found the dagger. And then, of course, the next Force time moment happens. And this one gets, like, absurd. Because, like, I guess they're having a lightsaber fight, essentially, through the Force time connection. I have kind of mixed feelings about it. Because, like, on one hand, like, it is visually interesting. And it's, like, it does make logical sense that, in The Last Jedi, there's the little bit where, like, Kylo Ren feels the water from the planet that Rey is on. Um, but it also, it's like, so they could just boom at any time. Like, the reason it was such a good storytelling device in The Last Jedi is because ultimately it wasn't like a power. It was like, here's a contrivance that we've set up so that our main villain and our main hero can be in constant communication with each other. We can evolve and continue to build this complex relationship between our hero and our villain, even though sort of the general plot construction of a fantasy film kind of requires our protagonist to be in training during this period in the film. Like it, so it's certainly a contrivance in The Last Jedi, but The Last Jedi kind of twists it at the end where it's like, oh, actually Snoke built this connection so that essentially he could trick Rey into turning herself in so he could, give her the business. But in this, it's like, oh, it's kind of this more innate thing, which I'm not totally against, but like, so if they're like this connected, why wouldn't, and it seems like fast forwarding toward the end of the film, it's like Rey intentionally teleports one of her lightsabers to Kylo Ren so that he can defeat his Knight of Ren goons. But then it's like, why wouldn't he just teleport all the way up there? Well, is he teleported up there? Like, the logic of it, even though it is visually quite cool, does kind of completely fall apart. So I didn't love it, but it's hardly the thing I hated the most in this movie. So after that, then we cut it through. General Hux says, I want to do it myself. And then he blasts them, the 3 stormtroopers that are going to I was like, are we really... When this happened, again, just because the movie had been so fucking bad up to this point, I was like, oh, are we really going to like make this super duper drawn out so like Rey can just go and rescue them? Like, are we really doing like the James Bond villain bullshit? But then he just turns around and blasts the fucking 3 stormtroopers. Like, oh, we've got a little bit of a surprise. And then it turns out that General Hux was the spy the whole time, but not because he loves the rebels or anything. He's like, no, I just hate Kylo Ren. And I was like, oh, this was actually really smart because the first 2 movies clearly loathe each other. So, of course, General Hux would do this. And then he's like, oh, put me back on the ship, blast me in the shoulder or whatever. And then, they execute him right away. So it's like, we had this interesting dynamic, which General Hux was never a great character. But, if you're writing the script for this movie, it's like, you've got another sort of tool here that, you can play with in sort of your sandbox of creativity. But because this movie always takes the most hackish, fanfic, bullshitty route, and they've finally found something interesting to play with, they're like, no, this is too interesting and like something that has the potential to be fucking good, so let's get rid of it immediately. So then it kind of reverts right back to like, oh, here's the problem, boom, solution, that the rest of the movie goes on about. So they've rescued Chewbacca. They've got the dagger that I guess Chewbacca was holding on to for some reason. And C-3PO has done the proper translation. So I guess this allows them to get to the mini pyramid. So they're like, oh, it's in Endor because J.J. Abrams and or the studio demands that we adhere to the philosophy of just absolute fucking the most blatant sort of circle jerk masturbatory fan service at all times. So it's like, oh, we're going back to Endor. Planet counter is now up to 6.5. I think it's like a different moon in the Endor system or something. there's weirdly a lot of dialogue about them discussing the exact location of the star map that we're going to. But so we land there, and then these people ride up on space horses, and then the space horse people are like, "We've been waiting for Ray for a long time." Um, it starts getting really weird about sort of the Force in general. This is where the movie starts getting better as far as like the construction of it. From the point that they land on the space horse Endor planet, it does get significantly better in terms of like not every single fucking moment feels like it was spliced together during an absolute mad binge on cocaine. So that's good. I was was glad that the whole movie wasn't like that. Um, the downside is that when some of these moments are given more time to breathe, they're still fundamentally bad decisions and they suck. So that's not good. Um, onward from that, then. So they kind of introduce this sort of. So this gets into. There is one more moment that doesn't necessarily mean it stops the like problem solution thing. So I'm going to keep pointing that out because ultimately that was the thing that absolutely fucking drive me bonkers other than the awful creative decisions, which we'll dive into in a moment. I've been saying that for 30 minutes now, but it's absolutely bonkers that it's just like, oh, here's a problem, here's a solution, and sort of just narrative tension and action beat tension storytelling it's so incompetent. So anyway, the new Space Horse people are like, we'll have to wait till tomorrow to get there because the seas in this Death Star wreckage are so bad they're completely untraversable. They have a scene with Finn and Horse Lady kind of like connecting, I guess. And they're like, oh, we're both stormtroopers. All right, fine. Again, it's a nice little thing you can introduce. Another scene that weirdly has a lot of space to room. So actually, this is scene number 3. I want you to count it. This is the third scene, although this kind of gets to the part of the movie where I'm thinking the reshoot. Well, we're getting more into my conspiracy theory, so we'll hold on to that for now. But it's one of the first scenes that you run into where it's like, oh, this wasn't like shoddily constructed to only communicate the absolutely bare minimum of information to keep moving the plot forward with absolutely no consideration for like cinematic momentum or tension or cinematography or any of the things that like make fucking movies good and worth watching as opposed to just reading the fucking Wikipedia article of the plot. So they introduce problem solution again. They're like, oh, the sea levels are rising. It's like, where's Ray? Oh shit, she went off on her own. Oh no, what will we do? It's like they set up this tension where it's like, how can we possibly get her? And then the space horse lady is like, oh no, we have another speeder. Let's go in. And then the funniest fucking thing is they never show anyone having a traverse. So you spent the time in the movie script and in the movie's dialogue setting up that traversing this wild sea to get to the space Death Star wreckage is a really incredibly dangerous thing to do in this situation, and you shouldn't do it. But then, because the movie is still, it's still pretty compressed at this point, they don't fucking bother showing us, the difficulty and the danger of traversing the wild sea to get to the Death Star wreckage. Like, wouldn't that be a good, fun action sequence? Having to try to traverse the wild sea, it's great. You have the opportunity to do something great cinematography, like we've never seen someone try to traverse the ocean in Star Wars before. It's just so obvious that there should be a scene, but because the movie is so bloated, they don't bother. So they get to the Death Star, found the dagger. Oh, Kylo Ren's there. Because again, problem solution. It's like, oh, we found her again. Here I am. They just show up immediately because we're still on the tail end of the cocaine editing section of the movie. They have a lightsaber fight, yada, yada, yada. From that point on, it's actually fine. Although, don't particularly love that Finn, who did, I think, get the short end of the stick as far as The Last Jedi is concerned, really gets nothing in this movie. So he just kind of gets to watch Rey fight Kylo and be like, Rey! Just the whole time. So that sequence happens, and here, oh, drum roll, please. Here is a sequence that I'm going to give good credit for. So Rey heals Kylo Ren, Ben Kenobi, after she stabbed. So Leia conveniently picks this exact moment to die, which is absurd and kind of borderline hysterical, but whatever. She kind of calls out to Ben because she feels through the Force that at this moment she needs him to help and bring him back to the light. And he's like, Mom. He doesn't actually say Mom. And so, and then Rey, in sort of her anger and her kind of lingering temptation to the dark side, takes his sword and stabs him. And then he's like, oh, fuck, I'm going to die. And then there's actually, this is the first scene of the movie. It's like, oh, this is good and like properly paced and like has an emotional payoff. So, she healing hands him, cures him. They kind of share a look, good stuff. Then, it's kind of like, you're Ben Kenobi now. He's like, but I can't. He's being all emo. It's great. And then they fly and fuck off. I guess Finn and his new friend just kind of decided to let him be too. Although it was far away, whatever. And then Han Solo's ghost comes back and is like, and it's poetry, it rhymes, George Lucas moment, sure, but, it's good. It's like, I know what I need to do, but I don't have the strength to do it. They bring back the line from The Force Awakens, and then he throws the lightsaber away, and it's like, oh, set up. There's set up and payoff in this movie and between another movie in the series. Woo! So, yeah, I mean, they're actually like, the worm thing sets up that she can heal, so she can heal him. Like, that's set up and payoff in a movie. That's called good script writing. Yeah, the talent that was in this movie actually got used at some point. And then it does the same thing with like, oh, George Lucas's favorite thing, the dialogue, calling back to the dialogue of the other film, and it contextualizes it. It's like it's poetry, it rhymes, and like it actually works super well. I was quite happy with that scene. It's like, oh, I don't want to kill myself anymore. So after that, we have a whole sequence. Planet number 7.5. She goes back to Island Planet, and she just decides she's going to do the Luke Skywalker thing. And again, another sequence that has good moments in it. So she's there. She torches Kylo Ren's ship, and she's like, I'm going to stay here forever. Luke's ghost comes back and is like, no, you fucking dipshit. I did this, and this was a terrible idea. It's almost as if The Last Jedi was a movie that existed, and we learned our lesson then that this is not the way to go about it. And she's like, I'm a Palpatine. Now, they do drop the fucking bomb. It's like, yeah, we all knew you're a Palpatine, bro. We still trained you. Which I suppose would be, like, fine if the other movie hadn't kind of pretty explicitly said that she was a no one. All these characters that allegedly knew about it allowed this to go on. And it's like, the two characters that definitely 100% fucking knew about it were Luke Skywalker and Leia, and these are the two characters that would know that this is a terrible fucking idea because Obi-Wan did the same shit to them and that ended in a disaster. So why would they do it to her? Wouldn't they learn their lesson from the original trilogy? No, because it does nothing matters except for retconning the previous shit to appease dipshits on Reddit. That's the only thing that matters. The pacing of the movie doesn't matter. The cinematography of the movie doesn't matter. Shit, the acting of the movie doesn't matter. The plot certainly doesn't matter. The editing doesn't matter. Nothing matters except for you need to make sure that every single complaint that like Reddit post number 4,000 about why The Last Jedi ruined Star Wars has been appeased. So that happens, and another like, oh, here's a problem here, we immediately fixed it, where it's like, oh no, I blew up the ship, how am I gonna get out of here? Boom, X-Wing. Whatever. And then we get another sequence. Leia's dead, yada yada. We get to the I honestly think I missed some connective tissue at this point, some Poe and Finn stuff, but whatever. I just kind of want to finish talking about that, and then I'm going to get super pissed about the Palpatine stuff. So, they set up like, I'm moving in, they get the plot. It's like, oh, hey, they're talking about, here's our game plan. It's almost as if this is typically what happens in a final battle of the movie. Instead of like, if this was edited in the cocaine editing style of the beginning of the movie, they would have just cut immediately to that, to like her being on the planet. Then it would have just cut right to them tracking her. And then it would just cut to like them fighting the fucking Star Destroyer. Oh, I know what I forgot. We find out that like Palpatine's secret Starforge fleet, every single Star Destroyer can blow up a planet. This happens in the movie. It's like, this is where J.J. Abrams, sorry, but like when you pull your own trick again, it's like, even though I don't blame most of the stuff in this movie on him, like that one's on you, buddy. I guess if we're going to give him any credit, I mean, I suppose he did definitively solve the whether you'd fight a duck-sized horse or a bunch of horse-sized ducks question from Reddit. So good on him for that, because I suppose Starkiller Base was worse since it killed more people and was more difficult to dispatch, I think. Actually, probably like equivalent difficulty to dispatch. It's actually kind of basically the same action sequence, but just more, and with a fucking bonkers anime ending and just much less competently constructed. But yeah, we find out that just there's like, I think at least like 10,000 Star Destroyers. Like it's basically all the shots they store of the Star Destroyers. It's basically like the army that never ends. And every single one of these can blow up an entire they can blow up an entire planet. It's like, the only possible villain is just a planet destroying. It's like, well, okay, last time we made a single Star Destroyer that could blow up many planets at once. How can we top this? How can, like, are you so fucking uncreative? It's just like, no, it just has to be bigger and even more planet exploding. So we did it. We have a star fleet. Every single ship can blow up a planet. So that's the two things that J.J. Abrams really, it's like, so episode 7 famously was completely constructed around the star map thing to lead people to Skywalker. And then they just did the same thing, but more of it. It's like this movie's The Force Awakens, but a total pile of shit. And then also just, but more. So now we get to the final battle. I forgot about all the shenanigans where you find out they find out that actually they can blow up every planet in the galaxy in about 5 days if they want to. And so it goes. So essentially, you've got three things going here. Rey's on a mission to defeat the Emperor, I guess. You've got the space battle. You've got the ground team. That essentially converges to become one thing pretty much immediately. And all the stuff in space, like basically the space, does more or less fall into the same flaw that I was talking about earlier, where it's just like, oh, here's the problem, boom, solved. So like the original construct of the action sequence is like, all right, we have the objective, we've got to take out the tower. Well, they take out the tower basically immediately, and then they do like, oh, actually, we could just beam the tower's communications up to the main Star Destroyer. Well, why didn't we do that in the first place? I don't fucking know. So it's like, oh, the plan's been spoiled. Well, I guess we'll have to go up and destroy the command bridge of the Star Destroyer. Oh, we've disabled it, but they can like reset it and get it back online. So then they have to like get the ion cannons on the Star Destroyer, aim them at the command bridge, and shoot it. But then it's like, why wasn't that the original plan to begin with? Because why temporarily disable the command thing on the main Star Destroyer when you could have just blown up the command bridge to begin with? That would have been logical. That's why. So it's like these three things all happen like basically boom, boom, boom. I think the second and the third one, it's interspersed with some Rey Palpatine stuff. Then Solo returns. Knights of Ren show up because, again, Reddit thread. Knights of Ren had to be in the movie because dipshits on Reddit are like, no, we need to see the Knights of Ren. Like, we couldn't have just implied in our head that like the Knights of Ren were a thing that used to exist. No, they had to exist in this movie, which actually makes it way fucking stupider because then it's like, well, where were they in the first two movies as opposed to with the previous two movies? At this point, we just assumed that they were, no longer around. So he yams on the Knights of Ren, who just end up being like goons with a fancy lad name. And the whole tension is just like literally the episode 6 tension, but with a whole bunch of bad anime tropes sprinkled in, because you can't just, everything has to be more. So in episode 6, for you younger folks that may not have seen the original trilogy in a little bit, episode 6, the entire thing is like basically Palpatine is trying to goad Luke into striking, basically whipping out his lightsaber in anger. And of course, it's a trick because he doesn't actually intend for Luke to kill him. He just intends to get Vader and Luke fighting. But okay, fine. That's obviously, Return of the Jedi is a great movie, so of course that's a good idea. But essentially, it's the same exact setup where she gets there and he's like, "Aha, you're here." Alive, just as I always wanted, despite the fact that I explicitly told Kylo Ren, the other most powerful Force user in the galaxy, kill her, but I knew he wouldn't. Which just fucking leans into the original bullshit of the prequel trilogy. One of the things that really drive me bonkers is like, oh no, actually every single thing I planned for from the beginning, the greatest planner of all time. Every single exact thing happened exactly how I wanted to. You farted to the left instead of to the right. That was exactly the way I wanted to. Expanded Universe kind of famously got absolutely fucking bonkers awful with that, where it's like, oh no, actually the Emperor had all these clones. Oh, well, I suppose that's what this was, because in the first scene of the movie, it's basically visually implied that Snoke was like built in a lab is like a literal puppet for Palpatine to control from afar in the Sith planet. So essentially, it's the same version, but instead of it being sort of a symbolic victory and essentially Luke throwing away his lightsaber is a moral victory for him over the Emperor, this is a very fucking literal thing because this movie is created for man children who are completely fucking incapable of understanding anything that's not super duper literal explained to them in space magic logic. So instead of it being like, I'm going to turn you to the dark side by making you use your anger against me, it's like, no, actually, this will trigger the spirit of like every single Sith Lord who has ever existed, whom I assume includes Darth Vader, even though he turned to the light. Or maybe he's just excluded and never had the Sith Lord spirits in him. And it's implied then, of course, that Palpatine basically has all the Sith Lord's souls inside of him. So he's like, no, you'll kill me, and then all the Sith Lord spirits will flow into you, and you will immediately become like essentially irredeemably evil forever. So it's the same setup as Return of the Jedi, but like the shittiest, most extreme anime fucking awful version of it, where it will extremely literally turn you into an evil overlord. And then she's like, well, then why would I do that? It's like, oh, that was a shitty plan. And then he opens the roof up and it's like, oh, the same exact thing that he did in Return of the Jedi. But again, it has to be super evil, elaborate, and like literal, like this will make you the Force power new evil overlord. Ah, God. I didn't realize how much I hated that fucking thing until I actually described it to you all. I guess the rest of the movie happens. Do I have any other comments? More anime ass bullshit happens so then Ben shows up and instead of doing the logical thing, which would be like, oh, hey, here's another one. Maybe we can get this one to kill me. And then it's like, boom. Which would have made so much more sense since Kylo Ren's original plan in the first scene of the movie is like, I'm going to hunt this guy down and kill him. So then why wouldn't, in this situation, where Rey's not going to do it, maybe you could create some character stakes by the Emperor being like, hey, that thing you wanted to do in the first scene of the movie, I want you to do it, and then you will become the all-powerful God Sith Lord. And then instead of just being this anime fucking bullshit, the character has to make a decision, and that decision has consequences. But no, this incredibly obvious setup that you've created from the beginning of the movie through now, that's not what they do. Instead, it's like, oh, I have the pair of you. I actually don't need you to kill me anymore. I can just, because the bond is so powerful, it can make me into like Sith godhood. So he absorbs all their life energy, but not really because they're both, or I guess 90% of the life energy, because of course Kylo Ren dies at the end. But he absorbs their life force, which he couldn't for one of them, but like the two of them combined, I guess the Force bond, which again, if you saw The Last Jedi, he was the one that created, because he is, of course, we find out Snoke. So if he created that, I guess he apparently didn't create it, because otherwise he would just be absorbing all his own energy. But he's like, no, actually I don't need this anymore, so I'm just going to like, and then now I'm a god, and then I use a fucking like force lightning to destroy essentially the entire Rebel fleet, but like not, it just like disables the ships, and I guess because it's electricity, and then they're gonna crash into the ground. But then Rey stops them, so then all the Rebel ships, because they haven't crashed into the ground yet, they can just power back up. Their circuits are somehow not fried or whatever, and then the essentially the movie is solved by like, oh, actually, two lightsabers are better than one. I'm glad we did all that so that we could just hear da 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 da, and then just see like a bunch of flashing lights like we're fucking toddlers, and that's the only way to entertain us. Is just like, oh, look at this. Just it's just literally like it's just like flashing lights and loud, vaguely orchestral noise, and that really is essentially this whole movie. Um, and then oddly enough, after the first 2/3 of the movie was again constructed in the style of editing which can only be described as cocaine. The ending is like super. It's not Return of the King elongated, but it's incredibly deliberate. I don't really have a lot of thoughts in it, and that's the movie. So let's dive into it. Let's call it the second level of suckage. So, why is this movie suck shit? Well, even if there wasn't this gross level of incompetency, I probably still wouldn't like this movie. Now, I may, it's a Star Wars movie, and sure, you can usually get some, let's just call it brain neutral enjoyment. Lightsabers are dope, action sequences are dope. It's fun to go to the movie theater with your friends, but it's just so incredibly morally sad. It's so creatively bankrupt to halfway through your vision, and who knows what like the JJ version of like the middle trilogy would be, I guess. But you've made a decision to commit to this, and it's like, why wouldn't you see this through? Like, if let's just say you're someone who's not like a fucking troll and actually dislike the movie for whatever reason, then it's not like if they hated the last movie that much, they're not going to go see the next movie just because in the first 10 minutes you're like, well, actually the last movie, it basically didn't happen. Because if you hated the other movie that much, it's like, why would I go watch the other one? All you're going to do is piss off the majority of people who had a good to great opinion of the movie. Again, this movie is critically acclaimed upon release, and there are a lot of interesting articles you can read about how the audience score was more in line with kind of how most of the Star Wars releases have been before these like Russian trolls or 4chan troll bots went in, and basically there was a targeted like anti Last Jedi campaign online where essentially there were all these bots controlled by either rabid fans or Russian trolls, depending on who you believe, to lower audience scores on the internet. And the audience scores like plummet after the first week, when it was like initially like, fairly in line with, the 70 to 80ish percentile that basically everything has been in, other than like the derived prequel films and this one now. So, well, and like, the older original trilogy, which would have a stronger audience score because now they're revered as American classics, and rightly so. So they go and make the decision. It's like, nope, actually, we'll just pretend that movie. It's like, it's comic book anime bullshit is what it is. And ultimately what this movie boils down to is a bunch of soulless cowards in suits sitting down and saying, essentially, this means nothing. It's Star Wars is just a money machine. It means nothing to us. And so we're going to treat it as the same sort of cheap commodity to be bought, milked for every last drop of blood, and pimped out for every dollar as quickly as we can. because we can't. It's not only that we have to make all the money in the world, we have to make all that money now. And so that's where you get into that, where it's like, because they're so desperate to get every single dollar they can out of it right away. And I want to emphasize the right away part, because ultimately, you know, if you gave even one single shit about the quality of things, like you can make quality films and still make all the money. I mean, even I don't think the Marvel movies are mostly, I think they're mostly kind of bad, but I mean, certainly I can appreciate that they have taken the time to construct a very, consistent style of movie that people enjoy. And they certainly, I actually kind of liked Endgame simply because Endgame was ultimately incredibly, it had flaws, but it was incredibly sincere. And, the source material between the movies had, for the most part, pretty good respect for what had happened in the previous movie. Like, there's at least some level of care taken in those movies, as far as just, well, we may have regretted doing thing X, but we kind of have to live with that creative decision. I mean, one of the interesting thing about Endgame is Thor: The Dark World, the basically the most derived one, other than the Ed Norton Hulk that they basically just pretend never happened for the most part. Thor: The Dark World might have been the most essential Marvel movie to see to understand the context of that film, other than Infinity War. Like, it's still, even though Thor: The Dark World was derived in, not as passionately as, say, this is kind of weird now that I'm going into a whole spiel comparing Thor: The Dark World to The Last Jedi, but here we are. Thor: The Dark World was much more universally derived than The Last Jedi, which certainly the people who hated The Last Jedi hated The Last Jedi, where it's most people yeah, Thor: The Dark World, shitty movie, and then moved on with their lives because that's how normal fucking people behave. But, people were oh, that's the shitty one. That was, even the Marvel people who love Marvel movies were no, well, yeah, but Thor, we understand. Thor: The Dark World and Iron Man 2 is the other one that got lumped in there as basically the, like I said, other Incredible Hulk, which everyone kind of just pretends never happened and isn't even part of the universe. But they're oh yeah, Thor: The Dark World's in this, but the Endgame's no, actually, this stuff that happened in Thor: The Dark World, maybe it was a bad movie, but it's also, it did happen, and we're gonna use the events of that as key plot points in the movie. So they were. It's funny and kind of sad to me that even Marvel, which I think I always viewed, it does give me this, weirdly gives me a lot more respect for what Endgame did, a movie that I already liked. But Endgame, they were yes, we made these creative choices. They may not have been perfect creative choices, but it's part of our legacy too. Thor: The Dark World was a learning experience for them, and they're I don't necessarily agree with all the lessons that they learned when I see the Phase 3 Marvel movies, for example, but nonetheless, it's part of the Marvel legacy. It's part of the what Feige calls the Infinity Saga, whereas this is so reactionary. It just feels cheap. It's I honestly feel my however many years on Earth I've been a Star Wars fan, probably so I'm 25 years old as of technically yesterday, but it's 2 a.m. So as far as as of West Coast time, still my birthday. I feel my 20ish years on this Earth as a Star Wars fan have been utterly wasted. It's so what's gonna. It's similar to the Game of Thrones ending, although I could never conjure myself to be as upset about that because I was super late on the Game of Thrones thing. But it's why would I with Game of Thrones in particular? It's why would I ever want to go back and watch seasons 1 through 4, because like I know where this is going, and it's like all the mysteries, or like I shouldn't say mysteries because it's not necessarily like a mystery show for the most part, other than season 1, which is a mystery. But with Game of Thrones, it's like all the sort of like, oh, here's what we're setting up for, all the build up and the tension. It's like I never want to watch that again, even though I can still appreciate that like seasons 1 through 4 of Game of Thrones are like maybe the best television ever written. But that doesn't matter because it's like part of the greatness of those is like how they're building excitement for these big events. Like we're anticipating the long night. We're anticipating, Daenerys landing in King's Landing with her dragons. And it's like, now that you know those things suck shit, it's like it makes it much harder to enjoy early Game of Thrones. Now, with Star Wars, I don't to me it doesn't, I don't care what it does as far as that, because the 3 trilogies are still they're disconnected from each other, both in just when they were made literally and then the actual timeline inside the Star Wars universe. So like they feel disconnected from each other, where like it's not going to ruin the original trilogy for me. And I think you're frankly being kind of a goofball if you're like that. With The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, that's where I do get that feeling, because it's like one of the exciting things about The Last Jedi was the feeling of where can you possibly go from here, because that movie had a sort of like, it was so satisfying of an ending of a movie that like honestly you could have tweaked the movie a little bit and been like, this is the conclusion to the Skywalker saga. Like you could actually recut the movie fairly easily to just say like, this is where it ends, rather than doing the Rise of Skywalker, which might, maybe for some people it's like, yeah, just kind of headcanon pretend Rise of Skywalker never happened. I know I've certainly done that with other stuff before, but it's inherently also Last Jedi is setting up conflicts and character moments for the next installment. And Rian Johnson clearly did have plans for his episode 9 before they more or less are like, nah, we're having Colin and JJ and their collaborators working on it instead. So with that situation, it's like it does dampen it. Again, because of the differences of medium in TV versus movie, I would say that it is not as disastrous, because movies are going to inherently feel a little less connected than a TV show does. That might be part of it, just because like I more or less binged most of Game of Thrones as opposed to like watching it episode to episode. Let me know in the comments of this 2-hour video if you have any thoughts on the difference between TV and movies when it comes to like the interconnectedness. But it does definitely like dampen it when like, it's sort of like the resistance is born today. Now we're ready to fight the Empire is more or less how that movie ends. And part of the excitement of it is like, in theory, and J.J. Abrams even said so, like, there's no way you can really be safe with the next movie when you have fundamentally altered some of the concepts that have kind of permeated Star Wars in the prequels, and then the Force, to a lesser extent, The Force Awakens. So it's kind of exciting. It was this exciting breath of fresh air. And then the next movie is like, no, we're literally just nothing in this movie ever actually happened. Like I said, there's some things that are retconned, the parentage. There's some things where it's just like a massive continuity error or a character motivation error. And So really your options are, if you are someone like me with my opinions of the movies, which obviously I think are their best because they're my opinions. Um, really your options are to more or less headcanon away Rise of Skywalker, or essentially just, done with the Disney part of the Star Wars legacy, and just we've got our three, honestly what a lot of people did with the prequel trilogy, which the prequel trilogy, let's just go and dive into it. How bad is this movie in comparison to the prequels? Great question. I would certainly rank this movie ahead of Revenge of the Sith. A movie that certainly still has some of the Lucas flaws in its dialogue. Um, Anakin immediately murdering children, like one scene after being like, "No, you must save him," when Mace wants to kill Palpatine. That was bad even at the time, but has some really good action sequences, lightsaber choreography, etc. that holds up today. I think the first 30 minutes of that movie are like really still awesome. There are some great sequences in that movie. The sequence right before he runs up to save Palpatine, Order 66 sequence is awesome. Like, and it tells a consistent story, beginning, middle, end, properly paced and everything else. So I don't even think it's a discussion that Revenge of the Sith is better. Phantom Menace, I actually think is improperly derided. So the Phantom Menace, I think more or less I would say the same stuff about. Maybe a less few good moments. I don't think there's anything as strong as like the Order 66 thing from an emotional standpoint in that movie. In the same way there is, the pod racing is fun, but and Jar Jar's in there, so he's a little bit more annoying. But again, so to me, my worst Star Wars movie would be Attack of the Clones. So that's the one I'm comparing to Rise of Skywalker. Attack of the Clones, my issue is like half of that fucking movie is the Padme Anakin bullshit, and every single minute is fucking awful. I don't like sand. I am haunted by that kiss that you should not give it me. Etc. There are a couple interesting things with Obi-Wan on Camino, but even outside of that, it's pretty bad. Even the lightsaber fighting is probably, there's not a lot of it in that movie, but kind of sucks shit. Other than the Obi-Wan Anakin Dooku fight's pretty good, not like amazing. And then the Yoda Dooku fight is like absurd. But I think Rise of Skywalker would be my worst movie. So it's hard to compare the two because they're bad in different ways. But I think the difference is that ultimately Attack of the Clones, you can feel it. There's an earnestness to the prequels. They're not cynical. They're ultimately still targeted toward children, and they're the singular vision of George Lucas to their benefit and to their detriment. They get bogged down in all the rules and the minutia of the space politics and the space wizard rules and everything else, but the prequels still introduce all these new things. Episode 1 brings us the droidekas. You get the super battle droids in episode 2. Every prequel actually manages to introduce a really good designed villain, if not necessarily great characters. Like Darth Maul's pretty sick. Grievous is visually quite awesome, even if like a little underwhelming as far as like actually when you start seeing them like whack it. Dooku's pretty cool and awesome. Like none of them are like great characters, but they're also like really small amount of screen time type villains, so that's fine. The character, they're not really meant to be characters, and that's in line with sort of the Flash Gordon serials that Star Wars originates from. There's still, but my point is like there's so much creativity in those prequels, despite the awful things and the really to the Attack of Clones, all the bullshit that I was making fun of. And this movie just the craftsman, like I think Attack of the Clones is more consistently bad experience. The last third of this movie, despite God, actually, the more I've thought about it, like even I kind of went in, I was gonna say like, yeah, I'll spend the podcast praising the last third of the movie, but like there are so few things I like about this movie. I like I said, I really like the Ben Solo scene and the scene after the bullshit planet thing. But that is honestly about it. Like even like I was like, well, yeah, the last third of the movie is a lot more competently constructed. Doesn't It's not constructed in the style of Cocaine, but it's like it doesn't even feel like Star Wars. It's like it just became an anime movie at the end. Not like good anime. It's like a stereotypical like heart of the cards shit. Like the movie essentially ends with like all the forces of good literally going into one person, and then Rey's like, she's coming to her senses, and it's like all the Jedi inside of her rising up. It's basically the heart of the card shit in Yu-Gi-Oh, where all his friends block Pegasus from reading Yugi's minds, but instead of that moment feeling earned because the power of friendship is the entire theme of the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! Jesus Christ, I can't believe I'm comparing Yu-Gi-Oh! Favorably to Star Wars, but whereas that's the entire theme of that first season, this was just like fucking masturbatory fan service. It was just jerking off and be like, Mace Windu, oh, remember him? His voice is in this movie for 2 seconds. There's every other fucking Jedi who's ever existed. I thought this was going to be longer than the Joker pod, but the Joker pod, it's like, I actually was like, here's some constructive criticism and ways you could fix the movie to make it a lot better. And it's like, I could see what you're going for, even if I think ultimately it was kind of a disaster. With this movie, there's basically nothing good to. I mean, I kind of wanted to get to 2 hours because, the anger seems appropriate for 2 hours, but, hour 43, I think we're going to call it a night. Please be sure to rate, share, like, subscribe, etc. Thank you and good night.